Thanks, Chairman. So I'll be beginning with a relatively familiar argument, which has to do with the significance of economic collapse and loss of political sovereignty for our political institutions. There's obviously a serious problem. The question arises then as to the extent to which the state's decision-making structures can provide a solution. They've been canvassed as providing a very obvious solution. The problem is that this approach, the approach of institutional reform on its own, ignores a big political cultural issue, the expectations and values of political elites and of the general public. So this is a huge topic. I'll simply scrape at the surface by looking at three issues, looking very briefly at three issues. Most briefly, at the very important question of electoral reform, how to elect Dáil deputies. Slightly longer, I'll look at the whole question of Dáil constituency boundary revision, and I'll conclude by making some remarks on the process of ministerial selection. The public case for institutional reform is a fairly well-known one. Irish political institutions are seen as suffering certain debilitating characteristics, and there is an assumption that these negative characteristics can in fact be corrected. We have an unnecessary second chamber, so the argument is, abolish it. Abolish the Seanad. We have an excessively large first chamber, the Dáil solution there, reduce the size of the Dáil. We have an electoral system that allegedly promotes clientelism and localism rather than allowing deputies to focus on national issues. Solve this again by replacing our current single transferable vote system by some other electoral system. There are other areas that seem not really to have got on the reform agenda, very infrequently highlighted. For example, the disruptive and, in many respects, delegitimizing consequences of having very frequent changes in Dáil constituency boundaries, utterly unnecessary and not part of the world of proportional representation. This could be altered overnight. There will be certain constitutional difficulties, but it could be done. By-elections. The British have by-elections. We assume that we must have by-elections too, but these are fundamentally incompatible with proportional representation. The holding of by-elections could be abolished. There are other mechanisms that can be used to fill casual vacancies. The Constitution would not need to be amended. The Constitution does not specify that by-elections must be take place following any particular type of format. We have a directly elected president. The significance of direct election is the president has enormous legitimacy, yet relatively few powers. We tend to define the president's powers very, very restrictively. Unless the president is given a specific power in the Constitution, we assume the president does not have that power. In most countries, the position of president is looked at from a more negative perspective. Unless a specific power is withheld from the president or head of state, then the president may exercise that. To give a concrete example, when we look at the few occasions when there has been disagreement over the formation of a new government, we tend to assume that the president has no power to intervene. In other countries, the president does intervene. The Constitution doesn't give him any specific authority to do so, but the president does so. The president can, for example, consult with leaders of the opposition or leaders of opposition parties. Ministers are all parliamentarians. We tend to take this for granted as well, even though that is typically not the case in other European countries. So I'm going to focus on those three issues, briefly the electoral system, at greater length on constituency boundary revision, and finally, so in other words, the first of these points, and finally, the last of these points. The agenda for discussion is, of course, much, much larger than the points I've been referring to. Now, there's a big difficulty, and the difficulty is that no matter how extensive the degree of institutional reform, we'll still be left with the reality that our political institutions are going to be run by individuals with particular cultural values. And there's very vivid quotation here from Fintan O'Toole, where he describes precisely these kind of difficulties. The fact that in the public sector, religious authority has been steadily undermined, but has not been replaced by any kind of secular morality. There are problems of personalism and clientelism in Irish public life. These are deeply embedded cultural values. So let me look then at the three areas that I indicated I'd be exploring. First, the electoral system. an area of old debate. So at MacGill summer schools and elsewhere, the merits of our current electoral system have been extensively discussed. The old argument in the 1950s and the 1960s was that the system was too democratic, too proportional. It inhibited stable government. More recently, a new argument has been added. It's still too democratic, but now because it promotes clientelism and localism. So I'm not going to engage in this huge debate here beyond noting it. I would say that most of my political science colleagues take the view that the problem here is a cultural one, not an institutional one. So Michael Gallagher in Trinity College has done very extensive research looking at the impact of other electoral systems on the manner in which parliamentarians behave themselves. The conclusion to which he's come is that regardless of the electoral system, culture will dictate certain types of practice in which Dáil deputies will engage, or their counterparts in other parliaments. Let me give an example. So I've taken almost at random here a quotation from the Dáil debates 1969, Tim O'Connor in TD for Kerry. He's complaining here, as you can see, about the inadequate facilities of the Pier Cahersaveen. Now, I'm not sure there's anything wrong with the Dáil deputy making these kind of representations. I would not like a situation where Dáil deputies never did. But the complaint is that too much of this goes on. What would happen if we were to change the electoral system? Well, we don't need to speculate in the abstract. We did have the British plurality system here from 1885 to 1918 in single-member constituencies. So what were members of Parliament in Ireland concerned about then? Of course, they're concerned about the national question. So let's take an example of the MP for South Kerry, John Pius Boland, famous Olympic athlete in 1896, elected for South Kerry in 1910. Here's a quotation from him in 1912, June 1912, when the Home Rule debate was getting off the ground. The great issues facing the Irish people had to do with the relationship with Great Britain. But Cahersaveen Pier surfaces once again. So the implication of this is that regardless of the electoral system, these kind of localist issues are likely to arise, and they're not necessarily unhealthy. A second example, Dáil constituency boundaries. We started off in 1923 with the 1923 Electoral Act, more or less following the normal European model. The counties became Dáil constituencies, with some differences. Cork was too big. Mayo was considered too big. It wasn't actually. Mayo was considered too big. These counties were split. Subsequent acts departed, beginning in 1935, subsequent electoral acts departed from this norm. And especially after the O'Donovan case in 1961, relentless tinkering with constituency boundaries began to be engaged in. And this process has been continued under boundary commissions, which have no choice in the matter. They're given clear-cut terms of reference. They're not allowed to have more than 5 members per constituency. They're required to distribute the population fairly between constituencies. So the result is maybe arithmetical fairness, but pointless arithmetical fairness, because commonly we end up with incomprehensible boundaries. I could give many outstanding examples from the most recent report of the Constituency Commission. I'll stick to my own county of Mayo. So here's what has happened to Mayo. Its boundaries the boundaries of the parliamentary constituency, the Dáil constituency, have been altered by the exclusion of certain areas in the south of the county, and their inclusion with West Galway. So the people of Garrymore, just outside Claremorris, where I come from, who are aggressively Mayo people, now find themselves linked with the people of Clifton and Spiddle in the constituency of Galway West. It makes no sense to them, and they resent it. Why bother? Why did we do this? Is it necessary? Not really. So, if we look back again at the 1923 Electoral Act, I've changed it slightly here by adhering more rigorously to administrative boundaries than the 1923 Act did. The two differences are Mayo and Cork. The 1923 Act split Mayo and split Cork County 3 ways rather than the 2 I've indicated here. This is the normal way in which members are allocated in continental European parliaments. For each census since 1911, because that was used as the basis of the 1923 Act, I've looked at the implications of simply sticking with those boundaries. Now, in fact, almost to the present, we could have stuck with those boundaries in almost all constituencies. What do you do after each census? You simply reallocate the number of members to each constituency. Now, this means that some constituencies will be quite large. You have some 9-member constituencies. That's what's so terrible about that. It worked in Galway in the past. We even have 10-member constituencies in Northern Ireland in the past. So outside Dublin, the system could have lasted to the present. There would have been a problem here in Roscommon. Roscommon would have fallen below the threshold for having 3 GDs. So I suggested here that after the 1971 census, Roscommon would be linked with Sligo-Leitrim in a single East Connacht constituency. Dublin is another matter, of course. Rapid population growth in Dublin would have meant that you would need constituency boundary revision there. In reality, we don't need it elsewhere. Now, there are some difficulties here. First is, for some reason, because Electoral Acts since the 1947 Act have set 5 as maximum constituency size, we assume we must stick with this principle. This is of questionable constitutionality. The average size of constituency here is 4 members. The Constitution requires proportional representation. Arguably, 4-member constituencies are too small. An average size of 4 members is too small for proportional representation. The electoral threshold is 20%, a very high threshold for small parties. The system I'm suggesting here would do some violence, not much, but some violence to having some kind of a uniform deputy population ratio. At present, the report of the 2012 Commission showed very little deviation from the national average, from about 5% above to about 5% below. The system I'm suggesting would have been 60% above to 8% below. But that has worked in the 1920s, the 1930s, and the 1940s. We did have deviations of comparable size. So my final point has to do with the process of ministerial selection. So I've looked at the process by which voters' votes are transformed into Dáil seats. The next question is the transformation of Dáil seats into seats in cabinet. Here, the Constitution does, as is well known, allow 2 senators to be appointed as government ministers. Since the 1937 Constitution came into force, this has been implemented and used on only 2 occasions. Sean Moylan in 1957 and Jim Doog in 1981-1982. So this has been very narrowly interpreted. If we look at the Irish experience in comparative perspective, it's quite bizarre. So we belong to a very small set of countries. In Europe, we share our position with the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom alone. But we interpret this much more narrowly than the UK. We assume here that all ministers must be Dáil deputies. At least in the UK, the House of Lords is fairly extensively used. For example, Peter Mandelson was brought into the Labour government by being appointed to the House of Lords. He was not elected, but brought into into Parliament by that means. The normal system on the continent is this one. Government ministers may be parliamentarians, but are not required to be, as in Germany and Italy. The final pattern, the third pattern, is one that's becoming increasingly common in Europe. Belgium has recently gone down this path as well, as in France, Norway, and the Netherlands. There's a prohibition on government ministers being parliamentarians. This prohibition has the effect of offering a much wider range of personnel from whom cabinet ministers may be selected, but also of greatly strengthening Parliament. Parliament is extremely weak under the Irish and British system because the most powerful parliamentarians are all members of the government. If there's a separation of personnel, not a separation of power, a separation of personnel between the two, then government is arguably has the capacity to be made more talented and Parliament more powerful. So this could be done, well, we could start without changing the Constitution, simply by making more appointments to the Seanad. The Constitution could be changed to allow the appointment of non-parliamentarians. This is the case under the 1922 Constitution, but the power was very, very sparingly used, not used. In fact, no non-parliamentarian ever took office. There could be a requirement. So the problem with this approach is that there will be huge pressure on any Taoiseach to reward loyal party supporters and not give cabinet seats to so-called outsiders. So the only way in which this could be secured, the only way in which outsiders could be appointed to cabinet, probably would be if there were a requirement on the appointment, for the appointment of non-parliamentarians. Or, of course, we could go the whole hog and prohibit the dual mandate. If you take up a seat in cabinet, then you resign your parliamentary seat. That need not entail by-elections. There are ways around that. So, to conclude, as I'm suggesting here, the real issue is the profound, long-term one of reshaping values, because the value system has a remarkable capacity to undermine any kind of ambitious and well-meaning institutional reform. So we shouldn't place too much hope in institutional reform. That's not to say it should not take place. We shouldn't place too much hope in it. So specifically, electoral reform, as I suggest, is unlikely to deliver the kind of results that are hoped from it, but this is a debate on this is already underway. The work of the Constituency Commission could, and in my belief should, be replaced by the work of an official in the Central Statistics Office who would spend half an hour, or maybe 20 minutes it takes, after each census, to calculate a reallocation of seats between constituencies. And finally, the ministerial recruitment process could be broadened, though, once again, this runs up against a formidable problem of elite political culture. Thank you.